Okay, well, let's continue our journey in the Christian communities and see how else Luke describes this to Theophilus. So, pulling up our PowerPoint, we had seen Cornelius' story and how that unfolded. So, our next stop is in Acts 15. Now, remember how we talked about external and internal challenges. And that really comes together when we talk about one of the main struggles of the Jesus community, and that is that of eating together, sharing meals together. And that is because that is a crucial part of social life at the time. Hospitality is big, hospitality to strangers, but also just sharing meals as part of community expression. And so once we see that communities are formed, we see that the earliest expressions of struggles also become apparent. And one of the things at the very base of that is that Jewish people did not share meals with non-Jewish people. And so this becomes a key issue. So let me back this up for just a moment. As we continue in our journey through the book of Acts, we pick up a main person in there, and we will talk about that next in the next PowerPoint. But one of the key members that is strategic in forming Jesus communities is a person by the name of Paul, and he starts becoming instrumental in forming Jesus communities. Now, he specifically likes to form communities out in places where there is not as strong of a Jewish presence. And he often builds that on the idea of finding Jewish people in synagogues, in the diaspora, in these Jewish communities out around the Mediterranean, but invites in non-Jewish people. He calls himself an apostle to the Gentiles, a spokesperson for God's plan for people among people that are not of Jewish descent. And so what happens then is that these communities, the Jesus communities, are made up of people from all walks of life, straight out of Roman society, as well as people who come from a Jewish background who now recognize that Jesus is the Messiah, and then people from non-Jewish backgrounds who recognize they need Jesus as the restorer of their lives. And so that brings with it the challenge of having meals together, because when you come together as a group, you never leave without sharing a meal together. Well, one of the main things for that is then that, Jewish people expect other people with whom they share the table to be circumcised, males, that is. And it also means that they have certain dietary restrictions. They don't eat swine meat. They would not eat meat that has been used in religious services that contain pagan practices. Well, that's what you would find in other parts of Roman society, where they worship the Greco-Roman pantheon, and they may sacrifice meat and flowers and good smelling things to pagan gods, and then later on offer that for sale in the marketplaces, so people can eat that. So these kind of things become a challenge. And so in order to grow these Jesus communities, Paul said, listen, it's no longer the first part of the Christian story, the first part of the Hebrew story, if you will. So you're not part of this covenant thinking as in the Abraham's covenant. The only requirement to be a part of God's story is that you recognize that Jesus came to accomplish just that. So non-Jewish people should not have to be circumcised. That's not a sign of the covenant. The sign of the covenant is that you accept Jesus, and you may want to be baptized, right, in order to have an initiation rite and to show to the world that you belong to this group. But circumcision is not a part of that. And Jewish people said, no, you should. So because of the meals together and because of some pressure of people who said, isn't it the easiest thing if they just become part of God's earlier story, getting circumcised, it brought on tension. So they decide to take this up at the place where it all started, Jerusalem. So we see in Acts 15 an attempt to come to a compromise. So they go to Jerusalem, where you find the early leaders, and they have a meeting. And so they come to a temporary solution, edict, if you will, that they then next take back to one of the earliest church growth centers in Antioch, Syria, from where they would leave to form more Jesus communities and to revisit these places out in the empire. And so they come to a temporary solution that they want to share with all the Jesus communities and say, okay, so this is what we do for now. And three things come out of that. One is that they say, when in order to make it work, all Jesus followers in these communities should abstain from things sacrificed to idols. So when you come together, you have these meals, whatever you all eat, it should not have been part of pagan practices. Those are not the meats and vegetables and flowers that you should buy. You also should abstain from blood and from things strangled. So what that means is Jewish people and non-Jewish people were very different in how they prepared and cured their meats. So non-Jewish people often killed an animal by way of strangulation, and then the blood stays in it. And if you, for some of you who object to the killing of animals or are vegans, I apologize. If you are a person here that hunts, if you don't let the blood out of the deer real fast, right, then your meat will taste, everything tastes like liver, right? It's very, very irony. So Jewish people typically right away cut the jugular and let the animal drain out the blood. And so that's also a part of their religious devotion to God, the way that they prepare meat. It sounds a little weird, but people do things out of religious conviction that sometimes doesn't communicate to somebody else. And so that was offensive for Jewish people to eat something that was strangled and to still have blood in it. And so they said, so let's not do that when you come together and eat. And then they said also, people who come together as Jesus people should abstain from sexual immorality. And that may sound a little weird because this is a temporary edict. And you're like, that's a temporary fix, which means once things get a little bit better, people could just participate again in all sorts of aberrant behavior. But that's not necessarily what we're talking about. So I'll show you in a minute what they might be talking about here. The big thing that's missing here is what? What was the big fuss over? Well, the big fuss was over circumcision. So they're not being called to circumcise non-Jewish people. So this is a big win for the group that said there's no need to circumcise non-Jewish people in order to participate in these services. Now, let me take a moment here, because this is typically when I teach in my classroom, the part that people are like, what's the big fuss? I mean, how would you even know if somebody is circumcised? I mean, isn't that the question that people are asking at this point? Well, I think that is because we're from very different cultural backgrounds. So in the West, and in particular in America, people are a little bit shy in this area. When I talk about it in the classroom, that's when people look at their toes, especially the young men. And I'm from the Netherlands, where everything is out in the open and we don't think anything of it. But you got to realize that this matter of circumcision is a religious matter. So first of all, we shouldn't assume that everybody knows what circumcision is. So circumcision means that very early on in a young male's life, often as an infant, actually in early Judaism on the 8th day, so when it's a young baby boy, a religious leader, not a doctor, but a religious leader would cut, peritome, would cut a little piece of the foreskin of the young baby's penis off. You would think, how is that religious? Well, we do different things religiously, right? Would take it off, and that's a sign of their devotion to God. People do different things, right? And so as the male grows up, that kind of nicely grows in, which is the normal skin structure. And so that means that the forehead always shows. Other people don't do that. Nowadays, in today's culture, it's kind of 50-50. So in America, a lot of Caucasian families, about 50 to 60% of that, circumcise their male babies. It's not a practice in most other parts of the world. I'm not really sure, honestly, what the practice is among Hispanic populations. I know it's somewhat of a practice among African American populations, but not too high of a count. It's a practice among Muslim families. Muslims circumcise their males, and then there's some other religious groups that do that too. I lived for 2 years in Southeast Asia, and all the males were circumcised there as well. And so the academic Council of Pediatric Doctors has kind of gone back and forth between the benefits and the non-benefits of it. So medically speaking, at times they thought it helped with prevention of cancer, and then they said, no, it really comes down to practicing good hygiene, so there's no pros and cons to that. So typically it's done now, typically because we've always done it. So in some families, they circumcise their males because the daddies were circumcised, and the daddies want their babies to look the same way. So it's kind of like a thing. Jewish people still circumcise. And so it was a religious thing, but because for us it pertains to genitalia, we kind of think it's a kind of like a thing that people snigger over, and people don't talk about it. And until a sexual partner sees the other person naked, they typically don't know if the person is circumcised. So it's kind of like a snickery, funny, uncomfortable thing in American society. But not there. When I lived in Southeast Asia, people would simply just come up. And if there were visitors from my home country, I had to warn them and say, when the people come up, they're going to ask you as a male if you've been circumcised. And to them, it's not a funny question. For them, it's a religious matter. Do not laugh. Do not insult the people, because if you answer that you're not circumcised, they're next, as a matter of hospitality and as a matter of respect, will offer you to circumcise you while you're there on vacation. And that's actually a nice thing to offer. So you'll have to very politely and kindly decline, but make sure that you don't insult the people, because these are very, very precarious sort of things that they offer. This is not an embarrassing sort of thing. So when people dealt with that in antiquity, in the first century, these were things that were talked about. Everybody knew who was and who wasn't circumcised. This is not something that people were snickering around about, that people were, even in common households, people sometimes, sisters don't know if brothers are circumcised and all that, because we are a society of shame about these kind of things. Not in my household. But so it was simply known, and if you didn't know, you would ask. Okay, so that's the thing, and then you would fix it. And if circumcision took place at a later point in time in a religious family, then all the males would witness that. Okay, so now you know everything about circumcision, and that was a thing, whether or not somebody was circumcised. So let's look at that. So notice how it actually leans on the Old Testament law, on Torah, the first 5 books, abstaining from things sacrificed to idols. So the Jewish people would find that in the book of Leviticus. Look at that in chapter 17, so that they may no longer offer the sacrifices for goat demons to whom they prostitute themselves. They said, we can't do that because in our law it says not to do that. And they said, okay. Abstaining from blood and from things traveled. No person among you shall eat blood. So they took that. There's also some scripture that says the life is in the blood. So they wouldn't do that. And then last, in that same kind of area of scripture in Leviticus 18, it says, none of y'all shall approach anyone near of kin to uncover nakedness. There's a whole chapter about, it says, who can uncover who, which pretty much is a euphemism for who can sleep with who, which is a euphemism for who can marry who. So the people in other parts of the empire they were kind of loose, as in who could marry who. So people would marry their nieces and their nephews, and they were very close relationships, first cousins, that kind of thing. And for Jewish people, you see that it's kind of spelled out who they could marry. And that is because they practice endogamy, which means close marriages within the villages and all. We tend to practice exogamy, which means we tend to marry strangers, and it's kind of regulated by law up to what family degree you can marry. You cannot marry your brother or sister, right? Well, the pagans sometimes did. And so they found that also abhorrent. So when it says abstaining from sexual immorality, part of the compromise then, right, was that they wouldn't do that. So here's the compromise. They said, listen, the non-Jews don't have to be circumcised. You have to get over it, but you also have to bring something to the table. So it will be a little bit harder to get your meals together because you cannot just buy it in the marketplaces where it has been part of pagan worship. At some point, you got to be sensitive to people's sensibilities. You'll probably have to get your own kind of cattle going here and do ritual slaughter yourself, cut the jugular, and make sure these people don't have to sit there and eat meat with blood in it. And then it sounds like the last one wouldn't be a big deal, but when people come out of a larger society and they decide to become Jesus followers, it's a big deal because it's hard to find suitable marriage partners, and it's a big deal in that society to get married and to have offspring. And to continue that family line, to have children to take care of you in your older age. And if you're going to restrict who you can marry, it has a higher chance that people cannot find marriage partners. These Christian groups were small. So this is language of sacrifice. I mean, even in our society, when I teach, I find that, some young people worry about it. Girls worry about finding a nice Christian guy. For every Christian guy, there's a gazillion girls, but for every Christian girl, there's not a gazillion nice Christian guys. Girls, I feel you, okay? So this is actually a sacrifice, right? And so that's what they came to, this agreement. And notice how it's worded. For it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to impose on you no further burden. And so it's recognized that these things are burdensome. And it's based on this thing that we later find in a letter that Paul in the Galatians, for in Christ you all are children of God through faith. This is why. As many of you were baptized into Christ, have clothed yourself, there's no longer Jew or Greek. And we're going to make that practical, no distinction. There's no longer different social classes, no longer slave or free, and there's no longer male or female. By taking away this thing about circumcision, there's also no separation between male or female. I know, of course, there is a circumcision for females. Female genital mutilation is a big problem in the world today, but that was not what they practiced as part of Jewish circumcision. All right. Skipping ahead again, at this point, the Christian population is being formed further around the Mediterranean. They pass over into Macedonia and into early parts of Europe, and that brings people to Acts 17. At that point, Theophilus starts traveling with a person named Paul. And so we get more anecdotal information from there. And he actually makes it to Acts 17, where Paul actually ends up in Athens. And so that's a very interesting piece because Athens is thoroughly pagan. You don't really find large Jewish groups there. And you see him interacting with Greek philosophers. They actually bring him in front of a panel of judges. And he stands on a place, it's called Areopagus. You see it right here. And in the backdrop, there's like all these temples. There's actually temples dedicated to gods, but also temples dedicated to emperors. And he gives a speech there. And the interesting thing is, in other places, you like remember when Peter gave a speech at Pentecost, he starts with the first part of God's story. It starts with the Hebrew story, goes back to Abraham and talk about prophets. Well, you're not going to do that in a pagan city. These people don't know the story. And so instead, Paul connects with the people and talks about things that he saw in the city and all that. And so that's really, really neat. it says, he's like, whoa, it's lots of idols. He does visit some Jews in the synagogue, but he goes on and he talks to these philosophers, and then they bring him to the people on the Areopagus. And instead of going, you're a bunch of pagans, what am I going to do with you? He actually makes them a compliment. I love it. He says, Athenians, verse 22, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the object of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription to an unknown God. A lot of people actually preach about that. It's not true that there was just one altar to an unknown God. The ancient person called Petronius said there were some 600 altars to unknown God. It's kind of like just in case I forgot to bring some offerings to the God of who knows what. Just going to bring an offering to who they're always afraid to tee up the gods. If you forget one, you might get angry. So they would bring periodic offerings to whom it may concern. And Paul picks up and he says, well, let me tell you about an unknown God. I know him. It's the God of Israel. And he says, this is the one. He actually created everything. And then he starts to talk about it. And what I really like is he bends the story and he talks about the things that interest the people from Athens. I'm a big fan of when we talk religion, when we talk church, when we talk about Jesus, we should meet people where they're interested in. I don't think that people should learn how to worship, that people should learn how to be a Christian. I think Christian ministers should learn what interests people and talk about Jesus in a way that connects to people. I'm a big fan of that. You know why? Because the people in the Bible did it. God meets people where they are. He did it in antiquity, he did it back then, and he still does it today. He's very interested in meeting you where you are in your life, and then take it from there. Absolutely. So look at this. Paul actually knew the kind of poems that they would sing. So look at that. He says in verse 27 that he wants people to search for God and perhaps grope for him, like go for him and find him. Though he's not far from each one of us. That's actually something that they believed. And then in verse 28, he quotes from songs that they would sing in pagan worships services. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. And then he says, okay, well, let's talk about that. And he uses that to talk to them about Jesus. And at the end, look at that. Some people became believers, including one of the judges and a woman named Damaris and some others. I think it's about the coolest thing ever. So let's see about these poems. Epimedia the Cretan, that's where he gets this idea of, for in him or in thee we live and move and have our being. Whoa. They fashioned a tomb for thee, O holy and high one. The Cretans, always liars, evil beasts and idle bellies. But thou art not dead, thou livest and abidest forever. Oh, you mean they like sing this to let us begin with Zeus. Never, O man, let us leave him unmentioned. All the ways are full of Zeus. This is an idol god. The sea is full of him, so are the harbors. In every way, we all have to do with Zeus, for we are truly his offspring. And Paul actually uses that to talk about Jesus. Now, he's not just using cultural stuff just for the fun of it. He uses it to talk about Jesus, but he quotes stuff like that. I think it's fantastic. So I don't know about you, but I'm saying hip hop for Jesus, rap for Jesus, country western for Jesus, paintings for Jesus, art for Jesus. If it is what you're interested in, do it for Jesus, bend it to Jesus, make it about Jesus. Let's meet culture. Let's do it. Let's do it, people. If it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for Paul, good enough for us. I like it. Well, then it brings us to the end of the book of Acts, and it just stops abruptly. This is kind of an anachronistic picture, but it gives you this idea, this reminder that they worship other gods. And then at some point, this guy Paul becomes the topic of all these chapters, and he actually at some point is taken prisoner, and he says, I'm actually a Roman citizen. Take me to your leader. Take me to the emperor. He says, I want an appeal, and it actually doesn't end with an appeal. He wants to see the church in Rome. We don't learn about the church, and we don't ever learn what happened to Paul. It actually says that he lived for 2 whole years in Rome as a prisoner. Hold on. We actually learn from a letter that Paul had written that he knew people in churches. Whoa. He knew all these people in all these churches. Why don't we learn about that? Why don't we hear about them visiting? Look at that. He knows all these people, and we don't learn about it. Well, maybe it is because the focus never was on these people in the book of Acts. The focus always was on God, on his Spirit. You will be clothed with power, and on this Jesus community spreading out. And in the end, the point is Theophilus. You now take over. You now share this message. And maybe all these centuries down, it's us. Let's share it. Let's share it with people. How cool is that?